Can everybody hear me? So I'm just going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So as I mentioned, muting if you do need to interrupt me because I'm just not making any sense at all, or suddenly my sound's gone or something like that, just dive in, jump on that space bar and interrupt me. That's fine. It's not going to get out of control. I've not had any issues so far anyway. As I mentioned, pop your questions in the chat and then we'll have live Q&A at the end anyway. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to compare three main systems. So we're going to look at composting, so traditional composting. We're going to look at worm farming in a worm farming unit, and we are going to look at Bokashi, which is an indoor fermentation type of composting. So what we're going to do throughout the presentation is look at those three systems, compare them in terms of how they work, how they're similar and different. Then we're going to look at the basic principles of each one, and so, what foods can go in each one and so on and so forth, how to manage and maintain them. Then we're going to look at troubleshooting each one, harvesting, so getting the goodies out of each one, and then I'll run through the free resources that are available through Moreland Council, and of course time for questions, as I mentioned. So quite a lot to cover, hence why we will save most of the questions for the end. But as I mentioned, jump in if you need to, because I'm not making sense or the sound's dropped out or anything like that. So first of all, choosing a compost system, probably the most important thing is to tell you what they are. Now, I'm sure most people are familiar with a compost bin. Because of the technology, I have a miniature one. This is my mini compost bin. So that's an example of what a compost bin often looks like. Of course, there are other options like compost heaps, compost bays, and so forth. The principles are all the same. I'm focusing, because we do get a lot of beginners, I'm focusing on the basic systems. But of course, as you get confidence, you'll push that envelope further and further and further. So a compost system is essentially a bin. I have to put it in front of me because I've got my background blocked out. Essentially, it's a plastic or wooden bin that you throw garden waste and food waste in, and it all composts and breaks down. A worm farm, again, it's probably the worm farm's a bit big to really show you on the screen because it blocks out. But so you can see though that it's quite large. But what I've got is a miniature worm farm, a representative worm farm, which is basically just containers that sit inside one another, so that I can explain to you how worm farms work. So a worm farm works in a very similar way to a compost system, except that rather than having something touching the ground where you're just throwing in all your scraps and garden waste, there's a little bit less room for garden waste, and you have layers. So you have a bottom layer, which is where the liquid goes, so we call that the basement. Then we have the ground floor, the first floor, and the penthouse. So the ground floor is where the worms first move in, and then the first floor is where they move up to once they're, all their families moved in and they've had lots of babies and they've taken up all the room. And then the penthouse is where they spill over to once those other two layers are full. So you're always working from the bottom up. And worm farms are particularly good for your veggie scraps, so they don't like too acidic an environment. You can put small amounts of acidic foods in, and we'll look at foods shortly, but they're really good for your veggie scraps. And what you get out of a compost bin when you harvest a compost is obviously solids that you then use in the garden. What you get out of a worm farm is both solids and liquids. So liquids will drain out of your veggies as they break down, and those cells collapse and so forth. You'll get lots of nice liquid in the bottom if you're putting in wet ingredients. If you're putting in dry things like carrots, you won't get much liquid, but watermelon obviously lots. So you're getting a liquid as well as the solids. So after we've looked at what we feed our systems, we're going to look at how you actually get those out and how you can use them in the garden. So with a compost system, I'm focusing at first on the two sort of outdoor systems. A compost system in a perfect world will get really hot, and you'll get that sort of steaming that you get off, say, a big pile of horse manure or garden clippings or anything like that. And so you don't need to add worms or anything. It's a common question I get. Whereas a worm farm is quite cool. The worms, think about worms a bit like kids or pets in a hot car. You don't want to sit them in the sun. They will cook. Worm farms will get hot like a car will get hot in the sun. So you need it to be in 100% shade. I keep mine under the veranda. And even an hour of sun's too much sun in summer. So just keep that in mind when you're picking a spot for a worm farm. No, they're not usually orange. I use orange because it stands out against my background here to overcome the technology. They're usually blacks and creams and more earthy colours. But yes, orange is a little bit easier to see on the screen. And a bit easier to hold a little pretend miniature one. So compost system works very cool. And then a Bokashi system, again, you won't generate too much heat with the Bokashi system, but what it is, and again, it's too big to really show you the screen. It'll just keep dropping out because I don't have a background, but I'm going to show you some pictures shortly. But essentially what we're looking at is a bucket, and I'll share my screen in just a tick actually, and I'll show you a better picture of one. It's essentially a bucket with a special ingredient in the plastic that is made from ceramic powder, and that ceramic powder helps with fermentation. So the purpose of a Bokashi system is to ferment or pickle all your food waste in the bucket, and then eventually it only takes a couple of weeks, you then bury that content in the garden, and it just comes alive with microbes and things like that. It's a very similar concept to, say, making yogurt. It's the only compost system with a smell, so it smells sort of like hops or apple cider vinegar, I suppose would be another way to describe the smell. So it does have a smell. If it smells like rotting, it's not working. You're going for that fermenty smell. So you're fermenting your ingredients, your food wastes, in a bucket and then burying them in the garden, where they then will compost. For a very long time, they will still look like they did when you buried them, maybe several months, because they're preserved. So all the magic's happening microscopically with a Bokashi system. They are designed for indoors, but you don't have to keep them indoors. As long as they're just at room temperature, don't go and stick them out in the sun. Keep them in a sort of fairly sheltered position, because you don't want the plastic breaking down and so forth. Now the magic with Bokashi, I suppose the one thing to remember that you really need is a grain or a mix. Now you can make your own. This is just a sort of a bran mix, which is essentially how it's made is molasses is fermented, and then off that fermented molasses it produces yeast and lactobacillus and all these other amazing probiotics, which are then sprayed all over ground up food, the food being, say, crushed barley, bran, some sort of a cereal grain. And then that's then fermented further or pickled further for another couple of weeks before being completely dried. Then once that's completely dried, it's bagged up and it sits pretty much dormant. So that is ready, it's a bit like yeast in your pantry or a yogurt culture that you've got there that will activate once it's put in the environment to activate. So that's the magic ingredient with a Bokashi system. You can't just have a bucket, it won't just work. You need a fermenting agent. So Bokashi grain's the easy way to go. If you do fermenting at home, of course, you could certainly trial doing fermenting with your sort of leftover, your kombucha leftovers, for example. So you can certainly trial a lot of different things and just see what works. I make my own liquid, so I make a Bokashi liquid. I buy the EM, so someone else has done the fermenting of the molasses to get me a concentrate. I then use that concentrate and put it with distilled water, organic sugar, all sorts of yummy things for it to eat, and let that ferment and do its thing for a couple of weeks, and then I use that instead of the grain. So how the systems work: compost, as I mentioned, you just kind of throw in your ingredients, and we'll look at how and the what's of that in a minute. Worm farm, very similar. You're putting in your food scraps. With Bokashi, you need to be layering those scraps of food with that fermenting agent. in order to get nice distribution. So if you just filled up the bucket and then just put some of your fermenting agent on top, you probably get rotting down low and only fermenting up high. So you want to keep adding little sprinkles of it as you go. And personally, I like to run mine very wet because Bokashi doesn't need air in there. So while our other systems, we're going to shortly look at how we keep them aerated, with Bokashi, we're trying to get rid of the air. So just pushing it all out. And I find tipping in my coffee grinds and tipping in my tea leaves, you know, still in the leftover water and that sort of thing makes it nice and wet and sloshy, and you get much faster fermentation action. So that is the crash course on the 3 systems. Any burning questions before I start to go into the specifics of how they work? No, we're good. Okay. So for the specifics, we'll look at feeding. So in terms of feeding our systems, we break our ingredients into 2 categories. Now, for a Bokashi system, you can get away with only using 1 category, the greens, but with a compost and a worm farm system, you have to have both categories. So our categories are known as greens and browns. They're also known as nitrogen carbon. They're also known as wet and dry. So there's a few different ways that they're known, so different words to describe them. So essentially, green ingredients are usually green. They're usually your veggie scraps and things like that, whereas your browns are usually sort of garden scraps, you know, cardboard, newspaper, dry leaves, dry grass, so the drier things. And again, they're often brown. Greens and your veggie scraps are usually quite rich in nitrogen. Your browns are usually quite rich in carbon. Your greens are usually wet, and when they break down, liquid comes out of those cells. And your browns or your carbon rich are usually dry. So that's a fairly general breakdown of the ingredients. Some ingredients might sit on the border of the 2. That's okay. It doesn't have to be a hard and fast rule. It's just a guide to help you remember to put in an even balance. An example I'll give you is if you're making a cake and that cake asks for your dry ingredients such as your flour, your sugar, and then your wet ingredients such as your egg and your milk or your water or your liquid melted butter. If you were just to put in nearly all milk and butter and hardly any flour, you're going to have a pretty sloshy cake. If you're just to put in heaps and heaps of flour and sugar and hardly any of your wet ingredients, you're going to have a pretty dry, crumbly cake. So think of composting as cooking, a bit like making a cake. So in terms of your greens and browns, having that nice balance is what makes the magic. And if you get that balance wrong, you can tweak the balance between the 2 to usually overcome most issues. So we're going to go a little bit more into what to feed our systems, but then when we go into our troubleshooting, we can actually look at a lot of the issues with troubleshooting easily overcome by just tweaking the ratio of greens to browns. Now, Bokashi, on the other hand, you don't really need to put in browns because it's fermenting rather than composting. So your browns are what gives you that balance in composting. When it's fermenting, it doesn't matter how wet it is because fermenting, it'll just keep doing its thing as long as the conditions are right for those microbes to grow. With the Bokashi, because you don't have to add your dry or your brown or your carbon-rich ingredients, it's a lot more forgiving about what you can put in. So just put in all your food and veggie scraps. You can put in meat, dairy, science experiments from the back of the fridge, the works. Pretty much anything can go in Bokashi as long as it's food stuff, it can go in. So processed food, cooked food. You know, your old chicken carcass from having a roast can go in. So, you know, all these sorts of things can go into a Bokashi system. So it does make it a lot more forgiving. And you can use more than one system to complement each other. So you can pre-Bokashi ingredients and then put them in the compost when you empty it. So I'm just going to show you in a bit more detail the greens and the browns. And I'll just keep moving my head out of the way. But look, it's fairly self-explanatory. Anything that's kind of colourful and kind of wet, judge it as a green. Anything that's kind of dry and kind of brown, judge it as a dry or a brown. So eggshells, for example, I would classify as a brown. Your browns would generally be very alkaline, not very alkaline, but more alkaline, which complements the acidity of your food scraps. So even tomatoes quite acidic. If you've got a cut on your lip and you eat tomato, it can sting a bit. That's how you know it's got a bit of acid in it. So all your fruit and veg is generally going to run your system to be a little bit acidic. So adding those browns and those dry ingredients is going to manage your moisture, and it's going to manage your pH. So it's going to, stop it getting too acidic. Now, if you can get your moisture right and your pH right, you generally won't have any problems at all, unless there's no air in there. We'll cover air shortly. So look, it's not a hard and fast rule. You can see in the middle here, grass. I've got grass that's green sitting in the greens, and I've got grass that's brown sitting in the browns. You might have grass that's halfway to brown. It could be really either. Just get to know your system and feed it accordingly. Now, in terms of ingredients as well, I do get a lot of questions about, say, dog poo. A lot of people want to be responsible with pet poo and not just put it in the bin, and they're sick of standing in it in the backyard, so they want to pick it up. So pet poo, you certainly can compost pet poo in any of these compost systems, and there are in-ground compost systems as well that I can show you later on. The thing to be aware of with pet poo, a couple of things to be aware of is, one, if your pet has just been wormed and you're putting your pet poo in an environment rich in worms, then you will end up with something that kills your worms. So the idea is to withhold your pet poo if the pet's just been wormed for however long the withholding period says on the packet. And if you're just not sure, maybe get an ice cream bucket, pop your pet poo in, pop a few worms in, see if they survive, and hopefully they do. Once they do, then you know it's safe to start putting that pet poo in again. The other caution I'd like to raise with pet poo is in terms of parasites. So I personally choose not to use my pet poo compost on my veggies. So I have a few different compost systems on the go, and I have one that's dedicated for my ornamentals. So I'll put it on, just flowering plants and things, plants that I'm not going to eat, and that's the one that my pet poo goes into. So have a think about maybe having a separate system for your pet poo, but it can go in compost, can go in worm farming, above ground worm farming, in ground worm farming, can go in Bokashi. I just choose not to use it on my food. The main one is cats with toxoplasmosis. So toxoplasmosis can harm unborn children, can cause birth defects, can cause all sorts of issues with our bodily systems. So just be very mindful with cat poo. But yeah, generally most other poo, once it's say fermented, once it's composted or fermented, is generally all right anywhere in the garden. You can actually have your cat or your cat poo tested for toxoplasmosis just to make sure that it's safe. So that's something you can do too. So in terms of the compost systems now, we're going to compare all three in terms of our acronym ADAMS. So ADAMS is an acronym that we use to look at the overall maintenance of a compost system to make sure everything's working properly. So this covers off, as I mentioned earlier, getting our ingredients right and getting our moisture right. So having that pH and that moisture balance, we'll cover that in here. But also air is another important one. So we'll start with aliveness. So all three of these systems are living systems, but they're living in different ways. A compost bin or a worm farm obviously is going to have all sorts of macro bugs. So bugs you can see with the naked eye. Worm farm obviously, hopefully, is going to be full of worms. If it's not full of worms, there's something wrong. If the worms have escaped, it might have gone a bit rancid for them. So lots and lots of critters living in there. Yes, there will be spiders. So just be mindful, wear gloves, supervise your kids. And if you've got allergies, of course, take extra precautions. Spiders are part of the natural living system. They're part of that whole ecosystem in a compost. So don't be too perturbed by the fact that they're there. They are part of the environment. So my hot tip with spiders, particularly redbacks, is the more you are visiting your system, so the more you're lifting your lid of your compost bin, or the lid of your worm farm, or pulling out the trays and having a good look in there, the less likely you are to have a big population build up of redbacks, because they hate disturbance. They're very solitary creatures and they really just want to be left alone. So if you leave your system alone, they'll move in because it's a nice, safe place to be left alone. Whereas if you're in there every day and poking around and turning it and that sort of thing, you may get one or two, but they're not really going to become an issue. So we will look at some other, I wouldn't call a redback a pest. They might be dangerous to some people. They're, you know, they are an important part of nature, so I won't call them a pest, but we will look at some other pests when we look at the troubleshooting. So yes, they are living systems. Now, on the other hand, your Bokashi system, you know, your fermenting bucket, usually in the house or at least in a sheltered position, is full of living things that you can't see. So you can't see all these amazing microbes doing their thing. Probably the only thing you ever will see, apart from everything starting to look a bit fermented, so looking kind of preserved, where you'd expect it to have broken down and it hasn't, that's really the main thing that you see. You might also see some white mold. So that white fuzz that starts growing on top of compost, that's the good mold. If you're getting the black mold, the green mold, the really hairy kind of grey mold, they're the ones you need to be really careful of breathing in the spores and so forth. So yes, that white mold is an indicator that all the good bacteria are doing their things. So that's aliveness in a nutshell. So they are all living systems, just in slightly different ways. So diversity is our next one. Now, diversity can relate both to obviously the diversity of living creatures in there, the more the merrier. I suppose the more variety, the merrier, as opposed to the more quantity. For example, if you lift your lid of your compost bin or your worm farm and you get a face full of little vinegar flies, obviously that's an imbalance, and we'll look at that in troubleshooting. So we're wanting a good variety of living creatures in there, but also diversity relates to our ingredients, so what we're putting in. So we want good diversity. We want a good mix of greens and browns, with the exception of Bokashi, which doesn't need the browns. And you will probably hear a lot of people saying you need to layer your ingredients. So, you know, you sort of think, oh, I've got to put in greens, which means I've got to put in a layer of browns and a layer of greens and a layer of browns in a worm farm and in a compost. It doesn't have to be in layers. Obviously, the more distributed and mixed up they are, the better it works. If you've got this much greens and then this much browns and they're not mixed together, that can just slow your system down and cause other issues. So obviously layering just helps with mixing. It's a lot easier to mix when there's just little amounts rather than having to turn over a huge amount. So that's why layering suggested. It won't stay in layers, of course, because you're going to be turning it, and that's good. So that's our diversity of ingredients. We don't want to just put in banana skins and cardboard boxes. We're not going to have much of a compost. So a lot of diversity. Get a bit creative when you're cooking in the kitchen. I do get a lot of questions about onions and citrus in a compost bin. Absolutely put them in the compost bin, because your browns are counteracting that. So the reason a lot of people don't like putting those sorts of things in the compost is because you can end up with a bit of an acidic system. But if you're managing that acidity by adding the right amount of browns, then you're overcoming that. My preference is about 1/3 browns to about 2/3 greens to get enough action, and just using the browns as sort of an antidote. But you will tweak that ratio as you go based on how your system's working, because you might eat a lot of watermelon where I eat a lot of bananas, you know, so yours might be wetter than mine. It's not a one size fits all. You're going to continue to tweak it, you know, for the life of your compost, and you'll get the hang of it based on the sorts of waste that you produce. Now, air is the next important point for both compost and worm farm. Air is essential because they are oxygen breathing creatures in there, and the bacteria also that are working in there, they also require oxygen. So you can get in there and turn the system. I'm just going to pop up a picture to show you a turner because it will be hard to see in front of my green screen. So you see this corkscrew beside me here? I'll just hold one up as well so you can get an idea of the size. So you can use a corkscrew, and essentially what you're doing with the corkscrew in a compost system is you're just winding down and then pulling up and winding down and pulling up and winding down and pulling up. And by doing that, you're turning things over, you're getting air in there, you're mixing your greens and your browns together, and everything's working happily. In a worm farm, on the other hand, probably a bit too small to use a system like that. So I just tend to get in with gloves on and just give it all a bit of a fluff. I find that's particularly useful in summer when the bedding's getting quite hot. So when you've had a bit of a heat wave, bedding's quite hot, giving it a bit of a fluff increases the air surface over the bedding, and that really helps the worms. I just thought I'd forgotten to bring my worms in, but I hadn't, so it's all good. So I'll show you some of them soon. Bokashi, on the other hand, doesn't use air. It's an anaerobic system. So instead of going in and aerating a Bokashi, you're continually pushing the air out. The easiest way to do it, I find, is just when I empty my stuff into the Bokashi, I use whatever container and I just push it all down pretty hard. So it's that easy. You can use a potato masher or whatever, but I tend to just use the cup or the bowl that I've been using. So, so 2 want lots of air, 1 wants none. Now, moisture is another interesting one. If you can get your moisture right, again, you will overcome or prevent most issues in your compost system. So in a compost bin or a worm farm, the golden rule, just picking up some castings here. Again, it's going to be hard to see because we're not in person, but we will do our best. So in my hand, I've just grabbed some castings and squeezed them into a ball, and they're holding. I wonder if I go closer. So that's just holding together in a ball. Now, if I squeeze that really hard, I might get, I don't know if you can't see the drips because they're the same color as the background, but I got about 4 drips of liquid out of there. You can just see my hand there. So that's the perfect kind of moisture level in a compost bin or a worm farm, that you're picking it up, squeezing it. You're not just getting slosh water coming all through your fingers, but it's not so dry that it just crumbles and breaks away and you don't get any moisture at all. The goal is for it to hold together like a bit of a ball. And I suppose the analogy that most people would be familiar with is if you're wringing out a kitchen sponge to wipe the bench, it's about that moisture level. That's what you want in your compost or worm farm. In a Bokashi bin, there are lots of different schools of thought, and most composters will disagree with me. I like to run my Bokashi very wet because it just really aids that whole fermentation process, but it can smell more. That's okay though, because I want the good compost. I don't care how much it smells. So I like to run mine really wet. Now with the Bokashi, a lot of people will actually, most buckets have a little drainage tap at the bottom. A lot of people like to drain that off and use that in the garden because obviously it's full of probiotics. It's, it's an amazing liquid. Really, really, really want to water it down so that it doesn't burn your plants because it's very, very potent. But that moisture is amazing. So me being the lazy gardener, I don't have time to actually pull stuff off and dilute it down and water it on the garden. My moisture just goes in with everything else straight into the hole in the ground when I'm burying my Bokashi contents in the ground. So that's a bit of the overview of atom, aliveness, diversity, air, and moisture. So if you can get your atom right and your green-brown ratio right, you're going to pretty much prevent any issues with your compost. And if you do get an issue, you can tweak air, moisture, and ingredients and usually overcome the issues. But we will talk when we look at troubleshooting about some of the more not advanced issues, but some of the harder to fix issues, and some tips on how to actually deal with those. So in terms of troubleshooting, there's basically a few ingredients that you will have laying around the house that will really make your life easier. So I refer to this as your medicine cabinet. So I'll show you, well, I'll talk you through the medicine cabinet in a moment, and then we'll look at some of the common problems. So in terms of the medicine cabinet, I'll just bring it up. So my favorite medicine cabinet ingredient is cardboard. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? Just cardboard, but the brown cardboard, the corrugated cardboard, the sort of cardboard that, you know, you get an order online from, Kmart or whatever, and it comes in a brown cardboard box. That cardboard is beautiful because, one, if your system's really wet and you add that cardboard, it soaks it up beautifully. It's got all these beautiful little corrugations inside that worms love. They will move into, it'll become the worm nursery. And if your compost system is running, or by compost system, I mean all systems at this stage, if your compost system is running really dry, you can actually wet cardboard and put it in wet, because that will then nicely distribute moisture where you need it, when you need it, rather than watering your system, where the water in a compost bin will probably just run off the sides. And if you water a worm farm, you're washing out all your worms and babies and amazing things. And I'll show you how easy that is to do in a moment when I show you the size of worms. Another important ingredient is a sort of a powdered form. These are all, these both are browns, as you may have noticed, but ash, lime or dolomite, very similar properties and very similar impacts when you add them to your worm farm. So they're all quite alkaline by ash, just ash from the fireplace. If you're cleaning out the fireplace or the fire pit, or the barbecue or whatever. And lime, by lime I mean garden lime, not citrus lime, and dolomite. So you can buy pre-made little containers of these, or you can just have the big cheap bag. Just find someone in the street that has it. Like, don't go out and buy a bag for the sake of it, because you shouldn't need it too often if you're using cardboard and brown leaves and things instead. Even egg cartons will do the job. So your browns are a really important part of your medicine cabinet. Now, comfrey is particularly good as an activator. Comfrey, for those that aren't familiar with it, is a herb that grows in the garden. Looks a bit like kind of lamb's ears, but mega sized lamb's ears. It's really good at drawing all the nutrients out of the soil. So when you do put that in a compost, it's quite high in potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus. And so it can really activate and get things going really well. But alternatively, you can use things like chook poo, horse poo. They can be really good activators as well. In fact, I generally would always compost poo, like an animal poo, before putting it in the into the garden, and that way you're not going to burn your roots. So something like chook poo is very high in ammonia, for example, which will burn your roots. So by composting that first, you're actually doing your soil a favour, because by the time you add it, it's in a really nice, usable condition for your plants. Some other activators that I love to use, every now and again, I'll put in a handful of blood and bone or similar into my worm farm or compost, because it really, what it does, it's very high in protein, which worms love. Worms will breed like crazy when they have protein, so I actually call it worm aphrodisiac. They'll be just throwing their keys in the bowl and getting to business, and your population will grow a lot quicker. So think about throwing in something high protein. As a worm breeder, I often use chook pellets as well. So there are lots of different things that you can throw in to really speed things up. As you get confident with your system, you can start playing with different ingredients, jump on the web, do some research. Hopefully you're all part of Compost community, and you can jump on the Facebook page or the Facebook group or on the website and share your ideas and knowledge as well. Because as a community, our knowledge is amazing. But I certainly don't know everything, and I love sharing ideas with the rest of the community. So those activators are going to overcome a lot of your issues, as I mentioned. So let's look at some of these most common issues. Scroll back up. And I'll just move my head as I need. Oh no, you can pretty much see everything. I'll just slide back a little bit. I just don't know if my microphone will pick me up if I'm too far back. So a common issue people have with a compost system is smell. So your system can get smelly if it's too wet, if it doesn't have enough oxygen, or if things are rotting rather than composting. So that can happen in any system. Even in a Bokashi, things can rot rather than ferment if you haven't added enough activator. So you'll know the smell, like most people know the smell of off food, rotting food, or even just that eggy smell. If you get any of those smells, it's an indicator that one of those factors is wrong. So if you get in there, manage your moisture, manage your air, and manage your browns. So add something from that medicine cabinet that helps with your pH from your browns category. You are generally going to overcome that problem pretty quickly. More often than not, it's a combination of it being too wet and therefore not enough oxygen, because as it's wet, it compresses down, and that compressing down obviously, you know, pushes out kind of your air pockets and things like that. Now, it doesn't look like there's any questions yet in chat, so that's yeah, that's good. I'll just close that again so I've got more screen. So again, next to smells, you'll see a picture of water and dry. You're probably quite confident now to deal with your wet and dry. Again, as I mentioned, I wouldn't water a worm farm, and I'm just going to show you how small worms are when they're born. So bear with me while I find my babies. Okay. Harvesting castings. Yes, Julie, we will definitely look at harvesting castings. Okay, so maggots. Yep, we'll get to maggots in a sec as well. Okie dokie. So what you can see here, where's my finger going this way? My finger disappears anyway because of the green screen. But these little egg capsules that you can see next to the ruler are maybe 3 meters. Imagine the size of the worms that would come out of 3 meters. 3 millimeters long. And within each of those capsules, you will have between 4 and 22 baby worms. So it's a heck of a lot of worms. Now, in the center of the screen right behind me here, before my finger drops out, there, you will see my fingernail and a tiny piece of what looks like wet cotton. That's a fairly baby worm, but not so baby that you can actually see it. So when they first emerge, they're quite, what's the word, transparent. Like you pretty much can see through them. You can see a little slither, but it almost looks like a snail trail of just that slime. They're so transparent. So tiny little worms. Now, if you're watering your worm farm, you're washing out those eggs, those babies, so you're affecting your population, and then you're potentially introducing this issue of too wet, not enough air. So that's why I choose not to water a worm farm and just put in wet cardboard, wet newspaper, or even some frozen veggies or ice blocks, something that's a bit more slow release, that can really help with that issue. So I'll just flick back to our slide on the common problems, and don't let me forget about the maggots, although they're sort of covered because we're going to look at fruit flies and things. Just in the bottom corner there, you can see RIP worms. I get a lot of people contact me because they've killed their worms in summer in heat waves. That absolute hot tip that I can give you to keep your worms alive in summer is next time you do a big cook up, keep some of those scraps, chuck them in a bag or a container and in the freezer. And when that next heat wave comes along, throw them into your compost bin, or if you into your worm farm. And if you're worried about worms in your compost bin, you could chuck them in your compost bin if you don't have a worm farm. And the worms can regulate the temperature by moving towards or away from that frozen food. So that is a really simple way to keep your worms alive in summer. Of course, the other important factor is where you put them. So don't put them where they're going to get any sun at all. You can even bring your worms inside in summer. So that's a hot tip. Snails is really there just to talk about bugs, because snails aren't an issue at all. They're in there eating stuff. We want them to eat stuff because we want stuff to break down. So that's all good. And I've got a picture there of, I suppose, slime or mold. It kind of represents both, which I've talked about briefly earlier with You know, in a Bokashi bin, you can get the white mold, which is the good mold, or the black mold, which is the bad mold. You can also get mold growing in compost bins and worm farms, particularly if you overfeed them. So if you're putting in more than the system can cope with at the time, that's when you can run into issues and the food will start to go moldy before it starts to decompose. So with a worm farm, what you get when you start a worm farm is you generally start with 1,000 worms. 1,000 worms weighs around about 250 grams. 250 grams of worms will eat roughly half their body weight, so 100 to 125 grams a day. And so if you're putting in more than what they can eat, food will generally start to go moldy or possibly even rot before they get to it. So with a worm farm, just slowly building up the amount of food that you're putting in there. So starting with a half a cup when you first start up a worm farm a day, and after 3 months, they'll double their population. You can build that up to a cup, and another 3 months, they'll double their population again. So you can double your food again. So after, oh gosh, what's that, 8 months or a year, you know, you're able to process about 1 kilo of food, quite a lot of food. So just build up slowly. Don't just hit them hard and fast. And with a compost bin, again, I often find it's because if I chuck in, say, bread or something, we generally don't recommend to put those sorts of ingredients in because they go moldy. So yeah, that can happen. But if you are going to put in something that's going moldy or something starting to go moldy, turn your compost, just keep digging it in. That'll actually really help speeding it up, which will overcome those issues. Mozzies are a bit of a given, I think. They love wet environments. So if mozzies are breeding in your system's probably wet. So go back to that brown category and see what can you add. Cardboard. Cardboard's always the easiest. There are other brown things that you can add as well to your system. And of course, with a worm farm, you can be draining off the liquid as well. I like to leave my tap open so it doesn't flood. Now, these little critters up, here's my hand, or above the water, is, I didn't flip my screen, is a vinegar fly. So they're those teeny tiny little bugs that find the overripe tomato on the kitchen bench and start floating around in front of your face while you're doing the dishes and drive you absolutely crazy. That's a vinegar fly. It's a type of fruit fly. And they're attracted to the gas that's put out by fruit and veg when it's ripening. And so if you've got a lot of material that's sort of ripening and starting to decompose in your worm farm or compost bin, they'll start to move in. But then if your system's quite acidic or quite wet, they'll stay there and breed and their population will explode. So some are fine, perfectly natural. Plague proportions, not so natural. So again, just let bugs be your judge in terms of, you know, what's kind of a healthy population, what looks kind of balanced versus what's, whoa, something's wrong. So in terms of maggots, I'm just going to open up my little chat so in case some more information comes through. So Lisa, in terms of your maggots, and feel free to hit the space bar if you need to add anything. If they're teeny tiny little maggots, they might be the vinegar fly maggots or larvae. And again, you just manage them with managing your pH, so putting in your browns and your moisture, so not letting it get too wet, and just keep turning it. Some is fine, but if it's just crawling, then there's an imbalance. So get in there, turn it, get the air in there, and get your pH balanced, and that should overcome most of that issue. You can get maggots, so say fly maggots and things, if you're putting in foods that flies really want to eat. Meat, for example, we don't recommend putting meat in a compost system or a worm farm because of that issue. We recommend putting it in a Bokashi system. A really experienced composter, I think Dan on here is a really experienced composter, will compost meat, no worries. But for beginners and intermediates, we just say, look, err on the side of caution, because if you make it too hard and have too many problems too soon, you'll give up. And I don't want you to give up. I want you to do what's easy so that it works. You can push the envelope once you're confident, but yeah, make it easy for yourself. Don't make it too hard. So I'm hoping that sort of covers your maggot issue. I do occasionally get fly maggots in mine, and if I'm really lucky, I get these other things called black soldier fly larvae. Now, black soldier fly larvae are actually better composters than worms, so I get really excited when I see all the capsules and things in my worm farm. So don't just assume that what's in there is bad, and don't just assume that they're blowfly maggots. Have a look at sort of the population density. Is it really a problem? Are there just a few? And try to keep an eye on it, see what sorts of flying creatures are then around the compost, to see what it might actually be turning into. Because if they look kind of like a black native wasp, could well be black soldier fly larvae, and that's exciting. Harvesting we're going to do in a minute. So severe issue with the vinegar flies, both compost bin outside and the caddy inside after a few hours. Okay, so I know this feeling because, you know, busy mum, I often have tomatoes that sit on the bench weeks longer than they need to. And once vinegar flies are in there, they stick around. So what I do, if I do get an infestation of vinegar flies in my little compost caddy, I sit it outside with the lid open. And eventually, between the magpies and everything else, it doesn't take long before they've dispersed. And then I wash that outside and I leave it outside until it's completely dry before I bring it back in. So I usually leave my compost caddy outside for a few days through the process and just use a bowl on the bench in the meantime. And then in the actual worm farm and in the compost bin, I get in with the turner or with the worm farm with the gloves, but turn it right over, get the air in there, add a heap of browns. This is often when I will add a few handfuls of ash from the fire or dolomite or lime, just something to really hit that acidity hard and fast and get it right down. You will still have them. The population won't just disappear, but it will hopefully interrupt the breeding cycle, and within a couple of breeding cycles, it should be back to a manageable level. So I'm hoping, Sylvia, that answers your question. And slugs in the worm farm, are they good or bad? Should I remove them? Look, they're not really a problem, the slugs. Again, they're in there eating stuff as well. Yes, they're annoying, especially if you touch them. It takes forever to wash your hands to get slug juice, slug slime off your hands. But then they're not doing any harm. So I wouldn't be too worried about slugs unless they're, you know, in an absolute plague proportion. I would much rather them move into my worm farm than my veggie patch. So yeah, I wouldn't stress too much. So that's most of the troubleshooting. The only one I haven't really covered is rodents, but I do get questions about rodents from time to time, so we'll cover those off quickly before we look at harvesting. Conscious of the time too, though we did start a few minutes late. So with rodents, with mice and rats, they may move in because usually in a compost bin, it's a beautiful warm environment. When it's working well, it's creating that heat, and that heat's actually really quite welcoming to them. And if your system is not really wet and sloppy, it's actually really nice to make tunnels in. And so there's all these warm tunnels full of food. So it's like a restaurant and a hotel all in one for a rodent. So what you can do if they have moved in is run it wet, which is obviously really unpleasant. No one likes damp environment. And turning it constantly so that they can't establish their little tunnels and their nests. So just that constant disturbance, a bit like you do to discourage redbacks. Do that, run it quite wet, make it unpleasant for them. They should move on. They may come in and eat. You know, if a rat or a mouse wants to get into any system, they'll chew through plastic, they'll chew through wood. I've had mice chew through the mortar of the bricks in my house, so to get to the warmth inside. So they will find a way in, so all you can do is discourage them. You can set your compost bin up on some pet mesh as well. So not just chicken wire thickness, but the actual sheets of mesh that hold their shape rather than come in a roll. You can put your compost bin on top of one of those on the soil, and that stops them just digging in from underneath. But like I said, if they really want to get in, they'll eat through the sides. So it's really just about discouraging them. And obviously keeping out their favourite foods, breads, grains, cereals, things like that. Now, harvesting. I'm going to show you in the my miniature versions, because it's just too hard not in person to have big equipment in front of you and the camera capture it all. So I'll start with compost. So compost, your compost bin might have little doors at the bottom, so you can just lift those doors and dig compost out and put it back in, and then close your door and keep going. It's actually quite hard. So my preferred way is actually to wiggle the compost in all sorts of directions. The compost bin, lift it up, put it down next to, I'll put it this way, put it down next to it, and so you will then have a nice conical shape of compost with the bottom matter being quite composted and the top matter still probably being quite fresh. In fact, I'll show you a picture just to make it a little bit easier. So you can see just at the very bottom, you know, it'll be nice and brown and kind of look like soil. It's not the best picture in the world, but a quick internet grab just to show you. It will kind of be in layers unless you've been turning it regularly and have 2 compost bins on the go, which is another great way to do it. So completely fill one, turn it regularly, but rest it while you're filling the other one. That's probably the better way to do it. But if you're working just with the one bin, you can then just take all your new stuff off the top and shovel that back in. So then you keep composting. So your compost bin, or my compost bin, just kind of does little circles in the garden as I move it each time I harvest. And then that stuff at the bottom is beautiful and ready, and that's what I then dig into the wheelbarrow and take to the veggie patch. So it's as easy as that to harvest your compost bin. Nice bit of exercise, and yeah, a lot easier than trying to shovel out through little doors and things like that. Now, with a worm farm, it's a little bit different. As I mentioned earlier, worms are in layers. So using, this is probably a bit too big for my screen. Oops, just letting someone into the room. So you've got layers, and what you would do is, as you can see on the pictures here, the bottom layer is going to be well composted because the worms have been in there and the food have been in there the longest. And as that starts to run out of food and you're feeding the next tray up, the worms will hopefully move to the next tray up. There'll still be heaps in the bottom. Don't let anyone fool you that it's that easy, that they'll just move up and you can just harvest that bottom tray. There'll always be worms in that bottom tray. They'll move up and you'll generally have the least processed food in the very top tray. So what I do is I like to take that bottom tray and sit it on top. Let me use this as an example. So I take this bottom tray that's got the really brown material in, and I sit it on top with the lid off. I go get myself a cup of tea, the Sunday paper or Facebook or whatever, and those worms are going to keep burying down away from the light. Now, they will bury down away from the light because instinct says birds are going to eat me. So what you can do, as they bury down away from the light, you can start to scrape off the material on top into a bucket, and you're not going to lose many worms. And you can just keep repeating that process till you get to worms, and read another article of the paper, have another sip of your tea, and then scrape again until you get to worms. And eventually, after say maybe an hour, you'll have a bucket full of beautiful compost. You'll have a tray that's empty, and on top, your worms will have by then dug into the tray that's full of, you know, got the apple core and the carrot and everything in there. That's where most of your worms will be, and you now have an empty tray on top to become the penthouse. So your new basement, or not basement, your new ground floor is now the one in the middle with all the worms in it, and that very bottom one's empty and now on top. So you're always taking the bottom tray and putting it on top. That is the simplest way to harvest worms. There is another way to harvest worms, and I'll just put it on in the background behind me. What it is called baiting. Now, worms love pumpkin, they love avocado, lots of different things they love. And so you could put something like a pumpkin, half a pumpkin in your worm farm, and within about a week, all those worms will have moved inside that pumpkin, and you can then rescue that pumpkin full of worms, hold it, empty the tray, and then put that pumpkin and worms back in. So it's a really, it's probably a bit easier. You will still lose some worms because they're not all going to move in to the pumpkin. Not everybody likes pumpkin, just most worms will. So that's That's how you can bait them, and that's a bit of a less hands-on way if you're a bit time poor. I normally find, unless you've got 10, 20,000 worms like this guy has, I normally find it takes a good week, maybe 2 weeks before the pumpkin's full enough. But you'll see in this example, the pumpkin, compared to how many worms he's got in there, annihilated in less than a month. So if a pumpkin weighs 6 kilos, you do the math on how many worms must be in there. Quite a few. So it's actually pretty exciting to watch time-lapse videos. Don't spend too much time on it, or you'll neglect your own worms. Now, a few other tips with your with harvesting as well, with your worm farm. Obviously, you can drain off the liquid. So there's a tap at the bottom. I like to just leave the tap open with a little container underneath, so that liquid's just always draining off. And then I have this beautiful liquid, which, again, being time poor, I normally just tip it straight into a pot plant because I need the container for something. But you can just water it down. So water it down in a watering can, or you can get specially designed sprayers now that have filters, and they're actually designed with certain sort of seals and things to withstand the sorts of things that are in compost and bokashi and so forth. So there's some options there. But just drain that off, mix it. The ratio doesn't have to be hard and fast rule. I just do it a bit like cordial, so a bit in the bottom and then fill up the watering can. I like to, if I can, use water that's been sitting out overnight, or rainwater, because the chlorine's evaporated, and chlorine kills all the good microbes. So I try not to use chlorinated water. It's usually, you usually don't have a choice, but if you're organised enough and have a bucket of water sitting out overnight, that's usually long enough for a lot of that chlorine to have evaporated. So yes, and that's just a picture of a tiger worm. Now, bokashi, in terms of harvesting bokashi, I'll just go back to my to my harvesting slide, sorry. So bokashi, it's really simple, and I'm going to take you on a really quick walk through the Compost Community website in just a minute. And there's a video there that just shows you really all you do to harvest your bokashi. Again, you can just drain off the liquid like you would with worm farms, but really, really dilute it, preferably with dechlorinated water, because it's so potent, and use that on the garden. It's a bit like giving probiotics to your kids. You're giving probiotics to your garden, so it's amazing for the soil. You have supersonic tomatoes, the biggest, best tomatoes you've ever grown. Bokashi, in terms of the solids, so you'll have obviously the bucket full of solids as well. You can either just dig a hole in the ground, tip in the bokashi, cover it over with soil, and that's done. So you just want to bury it. If you don't want to dig a hole and you have a compost bin, you can just tip the whole lot into your compost bin, give it a bit of a mix, just so that the smelly part's not on top, and again, that will activate your compost and it will go great guns. It'll be like Superman compost on steroids. So yeah, they're the two easiest ways to deal with bokashi. If you don't have a compost, if you don't even have a garden, you just have a raised garden bed on a balcony, you can certainly do bokashi into the raised garden bed as well. In fact, my big aha moment with bokashi was emptying it into a wine barrel and then finding, when I'd go to dig it up to add more stuff a few weeks later, it was just a plethora of worms. It blew my mind how many worms had moved in. So something about fermented matter, it's not just good for our gut, it's amazing for all the bugs in the environment. So I'm going to take you on a really quick tour of Compost Community because I'm conscious that we're nearly out of time, and then we'll have some time for questions as well. So I am assuming that nearly everyone here, someone's going down the wormhole with those videos. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, once you start looking time lapse of worms eating, prepare to lose about 6 hours. So I'm going to share my screen to show you our Compost Community. I just have to open it because I'm on the wrong screen, so bear with me one sec. Okay, that's it. Now, there it is, and share. Okay, so compost community for Moreland residents, well, for Moreland, Hume, Knox, Maribyrnong, Mornington Peninsula residents, but anyone can access all the resources. So what you've got here is a learn section, so you can actually go in and learn about food waste, or you can go in and learn about choosing a compost system. So this is sort of a recap on what we've looked at today. So what's the difference between different systems, for example, and then you can go into detail on any of those, or you can keep going back up to the menu. So worm farming, for example, you can actually go in and get everything you need to know about worm farming, go into the guide. It's got lots of frequently asked questions. So we have that for worm farming, for composting. There's even some sections on keeping chooks. There's Bokashi. So lots of really just handy resources for you. And then the other section with handy resources is the toolbox. So in the toolbox, there's a little section on downloads. So you can grab, say, the fact sheet of which compost system, my internet's really slow today, which system your your food might be best for. And while that loads, I'll just go into a different screen. Can you all see this new screen now? Yeah. So, and I'll just go in, and there's some kids activities. So say you want to get your kids really involved in composting as well, then you can, print out or do online some of these sheets. Worm maths is not just for kids. Worm maths is how you can calculate in terms of how quickly worms breed, how much they eat, at what point can you process 1 kilo, 2 kilos, 3 kilos, and so on and so forth. So I definitely recommend worm maths for everybody, not just for kids. And then there's sort of all lots of different products and prices. But so for Moreland residents, you just go order and then Moreland, and it steps you through. So Moreland residents can get really generous discounts off products. It's subsidised by council. So to find out if you're eligible, just read this little section, and then you just do a little welcome survey, which we then match the address to the address on your order. So you then go in and order the system. So again, my computer's really slow, so that's where you can go in and see all various kits and packages and things like that. So it's a really good resource for Moreland residents. And if you're not a Moreland resident, there are other sections as well. So just click on everywhere else and then public store or your council area if you're in one of the other council areas. So yeah, it's a really handy resource for you, and hopefully it helps. There's also, when you do join, very rarely, maybe once or twice a year, we'll send you an email just to see how you're going, and encourage you to join the Facebook group to kind of get involved in that chat. And also we love it when people opt in to have their address shown on the map. So we've got this little map that just shows where people are composting. So we're sort of building a bit of a picture of Melbourne. It's that whole concept of sort of leaders versus laggards, and then everyone in between. And so the map sort of, you can zoom right in and actually see if there's someone like literally 2 doors up from you. So there's an address there. So you can actually zoom right in and find out which of your neighbours are composting. So say maybe you've got excess compost or you need more compost, you can, go and knock on their door or whatever. So that's completely opt-in. If you don't want anyone in the world to know that you compost, you just don't opt into that. So again, we respect your privacy all the time. It's just all about education and sharing. And one other resource for you is community. If you have excess compost or need more compost than you're getting, you can drop off your compost by going to Share Waste. So just sign up at Share Waste. That's not part of our program. It's just a really good resource that we like to link people into. And community gardens. So if you don't have enough growing space and you want to expand, you can go in and have a look at all the various community gardens that might be in your area. So gradually building up that list, because obviously community gardens are growing by the day. So that's a little overview of Compost Community and the resources that are there to help you. So in addition to being able to send you you know, this video as well. Lots of stuff there that will help you through as well. So on to question time, because I know a lot of you probably need to go now. I have a question from Julie, a question about worm farms. Do you leave the newly empty tray on top of the farm and start filling it with food? Yes, you do. Should you lay some peat or other medium for the worms? Look, I like to just put in something as a bit of a cover, because what will happen when you have your empty tray on top and then your lid on top of that is, let me empty that so it's actually realistic. You will have the just sort of crusty bits of composted material there, and they'll dry out and the worms won't really want to go in there. So if you're adding food to there, having some sort of a blanket. Now you can buy a worm blanket which looks like this. That's just a bit of hessian. You can use an old towel, you can use a pizza box, you can use damp newspaper. My recommendation with whatever you use as a blanket, just moisten it a bit first, so don't just put it in dry. Yeah, so just soak it, squeeze it out, pop it in, and then that's perfect for the worms. They'll move in. So no need to lay any extra peat in there. You can if you want, but you don't need to. So a worm and compost bin is the next question. How do I separate them before fertilising my garden? So if you've got a compost bin with worms in it, or a single layer single layer worm farm where you don't have the different levels, it's a lot harder to separate them out. So you've sort of got two options. One is to do that baiting and try to get them all to move into a pumpkin or something like that, and save that, so at least you're saving some of your worms, and then just knowing that you're going to lose some into the garden. In a rich garden they should still survive. And yeah, the other option is just, you know that you're going to lose some as you go. If you're putting in the most composted stuff and not the really fresh stuff, so say it's a hungry bin or something, what you take off the bottom will generally have less worms in it, hopefully. In theory, all the worms will be up high. So yeah, just encourage them up high with foods that they like. And yes, for the latecomers, yes, we are recording. And once I trim off all the messy bits at the start and the end, I'll pop that in Dropbox and I can send that out to you. So just give me a couple of days to do that. Can Bokashi go to worm farms and chooks? With Bokashi, you can put it on a worm farm. I wouldn't put in too much, it's pretty potent, but they do love it. So I'd maybe just put in a couple of handfuls every now and again of Bokashi in the worm farm, and they'll just go nuts. And as I mentioned, throw the keys in the bowl and do their thing, increase their population. For chooks, look, you could. It depends what you're putting in your Bokashi bin. I know it seems a bit awful when you empty it. It's kind of slushy and disgusting, and I still have an ick factor with Bokashi, don't get me wrong. I'm a massive fan, but I still go ooh. So I don't know, I sort of think with my chooks, would I feed them something that I wouldn't feed myself? Well, probably. I fed them mouldy strawberries. So look, it comes down to personal opinion. They would probably love it, and it would probably actually be really good for them. Mine are getting some vegan yogurt tomorrow, so probably much the same thing. Yeah, look, Greg, if you do feed them your Bokashi and they go nuts for it, let me know. I'd really like to know. Mine don't get a look in because I'm on a sand dune, so my soil needs every bit I can spare. Yeah, but I'd love your feedback if you give it a try. Jump on Facebook and let us know. Thanks. Amanda, started with the worm farm about a month ago. How long before you can take castings for the garden? How long is a piece of string? It depends how much they're eating, how many worms you started with, what sorts of foods you're giving them. Just go by sight. Once that bottom tray is full, so if you've been feeding them into that bottom tray and now you're feeding them to the next tray up, if you do want to empty that bottom tray, you probably could by now, once you're feeding the next tray up. But if you're still feeding in that bottom tray, it's probably a bit too soon. Ideally, it's once you're feeding in the top tray of 3 trays that bottom tray is probably ready for harvest. So yeah, it kind of depends on your worm farm, but it will look, as I mentioned, Forgot I had worms in here. I was just about to do the squeeze thing again. But it will look, how do I do this so the green screen doesn't block it out? It'll be dark brown, so it'll look like potting mix, wet potting mix. So that's when it's ready. And Alexandra, I struggle to know how to distribute my scraps and waste between worms, compost, and chooks. Do I have tips? I share this problem because I don't get enough scraps for everybody, and so I'm forever like saying, give me your rubbish, people. Thank you to those that do need to go. That's absolutely fine. I will send this link out later on. So yes, I really do struggle between worms, between compost and so forth. What I'm going to do is really quickly share my screen again and show you a fact sheet, which is hopefully by now loaded. Oops, wrong button. So if you go into Toolbox and then Downloads, I probably should have gone to the one that was already open. Just minimizing my screen so I can move it around a bit. There we go. Downloads, maximize. Okay, can everyone see the download screen? Yep. What waste where? This is probably the handiest tip. So for example, avocado pip. Chooks aren't going to eat the pip. Worms will eat the pip from the inside out. Bokashi won't do a lot with it, but there's no harm putting any bokashi. And compost, it'll be slow, but no harm putting any compost. So, so this resource, the what waste where fact sheet, is probably the best one if you're splitting hairs about where to put stuff. But yeah, the biggest issue I have is I just don't have enough for everybody. So, you know, I'll be knocking on people, well, not knocking on people's doors, but friends know if they've dropped a pumpkin and it's, you know, got a bruise and they can't use it or whatever, that call Ella, she'll come and get it. So yes, I am known to buy food to feed my chooks and my worms. Not ideal. Ideally, you want to be composting and recycling food for them. So yeah, so this fact sheet's probably the best one to help you on that journey. Any other questions? No?
Oh, just a quick question. With we've obviously got the transfer station up at Hadfield that has all the tree loppings and stuff, but there's often a lot of eucalyptus and things like that in there.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a problem with either mulching and or composting?
Look, eucalyptus is very slow because it's got a lot of resins and oils and things like that in it, but it is also amazing for the garden. So in terms of, is it a problem, it depends on what you're wanting. If you're wanting something to break down really, really quickly, then yeah, that could be a problem. But if you're wanting to use it as a mulch on the garden, then it's probably ideal. So I guess it depends on your use and what your time frame is. I do compost a bit of eucalyptus stuff around here, but most of it just gets mulched up and put on the non-food parts of the garden because it is so slow. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, cool.
Can I ask one other question while I'm at it?
Yeah, of course.
I'm in a worm and composting group on Facebook.
Yes.
There's a guy on there who you may or may not have heard of, who's supposedly a worm expert. And his view is that wormweed is basically nuclear waste full of pathogens. And, I've been using wormweed for, I don't know, 10 years or 20 years or something. And when I first saw this guy, I was like, oh my God, is this stuff going to poison everybody? But all the rest of the community seems to be of the complete opposite view.
Yeah, that's interesting. Look, there's a lot worse you could be putting on your garden than wormweed, that's for sure. I would certainly be more concerned about glyphosate or synthetic fertilizers and things like that than wormweed. Look, if you're eating chemically laden food and all your food scraps are chemically laden food and you buy the cheapest vegetables that you know are imported from China and they're bleached in chlorine before they go to the supermarket shelves, yeah, your wormweed might be a bit more toxic than others. But, you know, if you eat quite clean, you grow a lot of your own veggies, you know, that wormweed, not so much wee from the worms, it's the liquid that breaks down out of those fruit and veg. So, you know, I know people that, you know, doing the clean living thing to the point where they won't even put in printed cardboard into their worm farm or compost because of the inks. So it comes down to what you're putting into your worm farm to begin with. But yeah, you know, it just depends how, I guess, how strict you want to be on that whole clean thing, but certainly not nearly as toxic as most things in the garden. And if you live near a main road and you're growing veggies, you know, there's benzene in the air from unleaded fuel. You know, there's so many chemicals in our world. It's so hard to avoid. I think wormweed is probably one of the lowest priorities that you would ever worry about. You may have a point.
I'm going to keep using it. So.
Yeah. And Tanya's question, I'll come to at the end. That's absolutely fine. Is newspaper bad to put in because of the ink? Again, it's such a good question. I took a photo on my phone. I wonder if I'd have to open up my phone. I've just got a new computer and I'm learning my way around. I'm going to see if it lets me open up the thing where it will show a picture from my phone. But the box my computer came in actually had a little bit of printing on it that said what the ink was made from, what it did and didn't have, etc., etc. So I'm just going to see if, yes, it does. So now if I go back into Zoom and share this screen with you, I love modern technology. Share screen, picture. So this says it's printed with halogen-free water-based ink on 86% recycled paper. So I love that. Good on you, Asa. So with newspaper, look, I suppose the ink in newspaper is probably a lot less toxic than other inks, but it comes down to how clean living you are. I'm a little bit relaxed because I live on a highway and I think, gosh, the fumes that come in from the cars on the highway, you know, they're probably just as bad. So I do every now and again put in newspaper, but I mostly put in brown cardboard with minimal printing on it. I try to avoid laser printed. You know, most inks are synthetic, but if you get most environmental products usually printed with, say, a soy-based ink or a plant-based ink and a water-based ink. I tend to be pretty relaxed about those. And then, yeah, once we're getting into bank statements and stuff, I get a bit more strict. But yeah, I just love that that idea of the halogen-free water-based ink, because it had never occurred to me that halogen was even in ink. So there you go. And just a side note too, when I do edit this, I may have to cut out bits if it does, when I share screen, if it does show people's faces. Yeah, but just for everyone's privacy. So some of these questions might not come through, but yeah, hopefully it doesn't. I think it will only share mine, only record mine. So yeah, so that's my answer on newspaper. It's down to the individual. Any other questions? Well, look, if I have missed a question or you've got a burning question later, just look up Compost Community in Facebook and jump on the group and or the page and just ask questions there, because if I'm not around, someone else in the community can answer as well. That's a whole beautiful thing about us all being an online community. So yes, are curly blackworms bad if left with the, oh, it's jumping all over the place now. If left with the known worms. I don't even know curly blackworms. Wondering if you're talking about millipedes maybe, or centipedes. Look, I've got all sorts of critters growing in my worm farm and compost bin, and unless they're, you know, attacking me or in a plague proportion, I don't worry too much about them. So I guess not. Using compost to create vegetable garden bed mix. Yeah, absolutely. How much mix of sand to potting mix to compost? Look, it depends what you're trying to grow. I'm the lazy gardener. I don't even go out and buy potting mix and stuff like that, I'll really just, if I'm doing a raised garden bed, I'll just sort of do half soil from what's right there, and just keep topping it up with compost. And I'm just forever just topping up with compost after that, because the compost is going to continue to break down, and so the level keeps dropping. So yeah, I don't even worry about the ratios. I just keep adding. But a real really passionate horticulturalist will have set ratios of sand to potting mix to compost based on the crop, but a lot will come down to your soil as well. So I'm in a sand dune, so I don't really need to add anything except compost, but if you're on clay, you probably want to add a bit of sand and other things as well, maybe some gypsum. Yeah, it's depends a lot on your soil. And just in terms of those curly black worms, often exist with snails and slugs. Thank you for that, Hussein. Yes, so it probably is those same ones that we get. And yeah, nice feedback. Thank you for the nice feedback. It's always nice. Yeah, like I said, any questions, jump on Compost Community. I will send out this this prezzo once I've had a chance just to make sure there's no privacy issues, and I cut all bits of preamble out. But other than that, yes, I think it's time to sign off, and hopefully the weather forecast for the next 2 days is accurate, because it sounded good last time I heard. So it'd be great to get out in the garden. Okay, thanks everybody. I'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks,
Bye.
Anna.
Bye.
You.